Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending, of course, where you are in the world. My name is Harmen van Sprang. I'm the co-founder of the Sharing Cities Alliance, and I'm very pleased to have Patrik Schumacher joining us today to discuss the topic of Metaverse and the city. Patrik Schumacher is principal of Zaha Hadid Architects. I think you all know that. He's studied philosophy, mathematics, and architecture in Bonn, Stuttgart, and London, and received his PhD at the Institute for Cultural Science in Klagenfurt. Welcome, Patrik. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today.
Welcome, everybody. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, before we start, I would like to express my ambition to have a chat with you, Patrik, that also my two teenage daughters could follow. The Metaverse is something that probably my daughters and their generation will see as a significant part of the way they will live, work, and play. So let's see if we can make it understandable also for them, if you may. Of course, you're designing a city in the Metaverse. And I saw some amazing designs, for example, of a city hall and of several working spaces and also galleries and, of course, all the land in between. So two questions to, of course, start this session with is it the first time you're creating an entire city? And may I also ask in the same question, what is your definition or at least your perception of the Metaverse?
Well, we've done many master plans for large-scale city expansions, not full cities, and mostly in Asia. So we know how to build up clusters of buildings and create an urban fabric, and also think about expansion and phasing strategies for that. And the problems of metaverse urbanism are very similar to the problems of real urbanism, like as well design of spaces and architecture. So there's a very strong analogy which I think is being utilized and which we rely on also to make these new virtual spaces and cities legible, navigable, understandable. So we will come in with a lot of realism and banking on that pre-understanding, that intuitive sense of orienting and understanding and distinguishing offerings and urban offerings and places and social situations. So that's very important. And that's for me the immersive internet, where we have also we can display and make information accessible, but it's mostly of social interactions and the way they are distributed and accessible and can be joined through a browsing navigation rather than through a textual navigation. I think it's very important. So we're shifting from the magazine analogy to the building or architecture and city analogy. So we have done that before, and as I said, I mean, the issues are quite similar in many ways. And there's also even real estate development and land economy to be considered. There are co-location synergies, and that's the big point. So we can imagine everybody absolutely going into virtual spaces, and every single organization will have augment its website with virtual spaces. But what is important is the city, an agglomeration of like-minded and possibly related institutions who want their spaces to be next to each other, so that there is footfall, there is synergies, co-location synergies. And I think that's what's important about the Metaverse as a virtual city over and above individual freestanding, let's say, isolated virtual spaces.
Very interesting. And if I hear you talking about sort of leaving the phase of the magazine, is that maybe something that you've been waiting for already for quite some time? Because you're, I think, many times ahead of the game. So I must think that leaving this phase of the magazine, so to say, as a metaphor, is sort of sparking your mind.
Very much so. Actually, it should. There were a lot of ideas in the late '80s kicking off the internet as based on the idea of the metaverse, or it was called cyberspace at the time as well. So this idea of more of a cityscape and a space, an information space, a navigable information space, anticipated through a number of science fiction novels, and that was picked up in architecture in the late '80s and into the early '90s. I was teaching in Berlin University from '94 to '96. So in '95, I did the virtual college as a design project, which was a 3D virtual university concept, but it didn't happen. When the internet was still in its infancy at the time, there wasn't much to be seen in Germany for sure.
No.
And some universities were the first ones where you could have something going, but there wasn't much on there. So already architects thought that this would be we as architects thought is our domain, but then it became obviously the domain of the graphic designers.
Yeah.
So all of the internet is, of course, it needs designers to articulate and spatialize information, and became the graphic designers as a profession and paradigm based on the analogy of the magazine. So, but now it's funny. I realized when COVID struck, that the moment had come.
Yeah.
For cyberspace.
A blessing in disguise. So it's fascinating to see an ever-expanding symbiosis between our physical world and the virtual world, of course. And looking at this symbiosis, how do you see your perception of a virtual city in the metaverse intertwined with a physical space like Liberland? So, and if it's possible, maybe on the way in your answer also expand a little bit of what Liberland is and what it's going to be, please.
Yes, so I think this will have multiple dimensions. I mean, we're starting to talk about, let's say, for instance, universities or corporate entities, corporate campuses setting up their own virtual spaces. And that would be initially standalone. They can start there. And at that point, I would integrate it strongly with the existing physical facilities somehow. And I was thinking about, we have some clients basing the design of virtual expansions, virtual augmentations on the current design, and also allow for perceiving or joining these virtual spaces together on site, and then invite in remote participants as well. So the idea of these kind of cyber, I call it also cyber urban fusion, or the cyber physical campus and buildings. So here we're talking about bringing together some on-site, a mixed mode, mixed reality, as well as all the new work patterns are about mixed mode, where some people are coming in, others are staying home. And we need to find a way to integrate that rather than transferring everything only into a digital medium, which is through isolated faces appearing in the grid like Zoom. So that's one story. This could also apply to urban spaces. And in Liberland, we do have this as well, which we also thought about earlier, that you can kickstart and anticipate a development first online, like a city expansion or a newfound city like Liberland, to build up the community and to anticipate and also start using facilities and spaces and bring together those co-location synergies virtually, with the hope that eventually some of them or many of them come together and also physically locate in the spaces. And that is a principle which also goes for larger, business parks and places like that, where you can kind of kickstart them. And then the question is, there is a close similarity and interweaving of urban virtual spaces. So the virtual spaces will anticipate, but they continue to exist, and then they have to be folded into the physical. And in the physical, we can imagine, on the one hand, holographic projections, huge panoramic screens, a lot of windows into the virtual world. I mean, some of the walls and interfaces will become windows into the virtual world, and the space continues there. So that's the vision, which also would work on an urban level. And I have studied that with students at the Architectural Association Design Research Lab, already a number of iterations, where we started with the cyber urban incubator idea, individual buildings, and currently working on metaverse urbanism. So yeah, I think it's very pertinent and important that we don't presume that everybody is participating in these spaces only in isolation from home, but that we also can be together and then still share with a larger group of virtual presencings. So you have that mixed mode of two audiences meeting, or you have group sessions. Cities and architectures within it, they should be the interfaces into these virtual expansion, virtual worlds.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take. I love that one. when creating an entire city from the ground up, and of course you mentioned already, I think, something about that symbiosis that we talked about, but in what sense are you maybe even building an urban utopia or sort of an ideal city? So you know, and why and how can both sides to the story, virtual and physical, can benefit from that idea most?
Well, what's very nice about it, of course, with students we can speculate, but also with a place like Liberland, and we're working with some other metaverse companies also who have ambitions to generate a metaverse city. The great thing here is at the moment there's more degrees of freedom. It's not only that we can be more light-footed and dynamic with our creations, but also these spaces are not politically overburdened. My feeling has been in recent years that cities in Europe in particular, but nearly everywhere around the world, they're heavily politically determined, which slows down progress, process building, but it also is highly restrictive in terms of land use stipulations, even though and categorizations and prescriptions about densities, heights, even when it comes to residential unit mixes and the size of individual rooms, there's very little degrees of freedom and very little entrepreneurial freedom. So there's too much predetermination. I think that's hampering these co-location synergies, which are so important when you can't convert residentially a residential space into commercial or workspace or vice versa. In the metaverse, of course, these constraints fall away and we can really experiment with new planning concepts with more degrees of freedom. There still needs to be, I think, some planning, and one can distinguish kind of more curated concepts from those where you allow degrees of self-organization through landowner associations, for instance, as well as much more radical free-for-all conditions. And that's the way we're thinking in Liberland, that we have different zones with different regimes, and we can see how the market responds, how people like it. We need to start with the curated seats so that is actually already spaces to move into, actually pre-designed even. There will be those zones where those who buy in collectively would self-organize as a DAO, for instance, to further then amongst themselves write the rules of the city expansion. And then there will be zones which I call really the free-for-all, highly unconstrained zones where you can join and they also then have to live with and do what you please, and people can find each other and build these synergies, but you also then have to live with the fact that somebody else next to you might do things you didn't find congenial. And so, but my thought was in this case, let's start with multiple and regimes in parallel to tease out what's the pickup, what are the problems, and then those more successful model can be expanded further and be rolled out more across the urban fabric. So that's my thinking.
Sort of a link between a utopia and something how it might work in practice, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is quite utopian, although it shouldn't be.
Yeah, true.
So, but it's something like this, if people get it and understand it and get used to it and are not scared of, let's say, more degrees of freedom for everybody, that doesn't lead into some kind of chaos and dysfunctionality, then maybe those ideas will migrate out and challenge city planners in real cities, particularly if there's physical development also kind of following these metaverse spaces. But even as such, if a lot of architects and urbanists are now working on metaverse concepts, and there is a new space of governance, urban governance, creation, invention, experimentation, some of these ideas will kind of feed back, I think, into the world of physical urban development.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, a little bridge to my next question, because as a co-founder of the Sharing Cities Alliance, I work with leading cities from around the world, from Amsterdam and London, Helsinki, Singapore, Seoul, Washington, some fabulous cities around the world, of course. And since the beginning of this year, I've been taking them on a, let's say, journey or exploration around the topic of the metaverse, called Metaverse and the City, and trying to just grasp, the opportunities on the one hand, and of course the many challenges that there are on the other hand. So you already mentioned a bit of policy making or governance, at least. where do you see most relevance for city governments, and what could or should their role maybe be if this metaverse becomes an ever-growing phenomenon and a part of our lives?
Well, one thing is for sure that it could directly be integrated into city development projects. So in a way that, for instance, new plans, new sites which are opened up, that those you can run competitions, but that they will be implemented as VR realities, and there could be an element of participatory planning and participatory urban development, anticipating the real constructions. So, for instance, that's also a colleague of mine, and we've studied that at the AADRL again, where we have gamified planning through playing with three-dimensional volumes and a multiplayer aggregation based on finding each other and cumulatively building up an urban fabric, an urban agglomeration.
Yeah, and that again is maybe something in synergy with what I saw also as questions from my network, because of course I told them about our conversation and also gave them the opportunity to look over my shoulder at least and maybe come up with a question. I saw sort of the same kind of questions coming from different regions in the world. So for example, Washington DC would like to ask more like, okay, who gets to decide whether to accept or reject application for citizenship in Liberland? And then all the other side of the world, Singapore is asking you like, who is most left behind by the metaverse, and how do we ensure that they keep up? And I think in general, maybe it breaks down to like, okay, how can we see it that the metaverse will be an inclusive place, a safe place, and a place where we sort of all belong? So what is your take on that, Patrik?
It's a niche metaverse offering itself initially to the crypto ecosystem, Web3 development, but also NFT companies and NFT artists and institutions, galleries who are venturing into the metaverse and blockchain. So that's specific to that, because Liberland also has a history of being interested in intersecting with that blockchain entrepreneurship. Its own governance process will be on the blockchain, and they've been early adopters of Bitcoin, etc., etc. So that's the world of Liberland focusing. And I do believe that there will be many of these niche metaverses where it's obviously open, but people find each other for particular interests. So we hope to host a lot of these blockchain companies and projects. The metaverse itself will be organized as a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. Liberland itself is one of the partners of the metaverse project. Everybody's helping, participating, becomes citizen builds up a kind of repertoire of so-called merits, or there's a kind of virtual coin called the merit, and this is the way you gain stake in Liberland itself. There's over 700,000 e-residencies. So the e-residency that you can just apply, and you can also use the jurisdiction of Liberland to set up your company.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's almost too hard to sort of get your head around and see how this will actually function. It's such a project, and yeah, it's fabulous.
Yeah, look, it's a big experiment. I know that if you kind of inadvertently jump into certain communities, you might find going a bit rough. I hope that will be entrepreneurial decisions, and those communities who get this right will flourish.
I'm afraid that we're already at the end of
we're running out of time. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours with you. It's absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much for taking the time, for your inspiring and sometimes, I think, thought-provoking thoughts that you shared with us. And I hope to see you soon, be it in your hometown in London, be it in my hometown in Amsterdam, be it in New York, where the event, of course, is happening, or maybe in the metaverse. Take care, and thank you so much.